The manifesto is, and you've already seen this in some of your prep work, is a starting point for all of us to have a more robust conversation about what church planting can bring, what it should look like, how ultimately it will work, and more. And from there, I want to talk with some of these church planting leaders, particularly about some of the questions that we ultimately might have. Now, Linda, you've been involved in church planting for a long time. I probably couldn't say the longest time of the group, but a long time. And in your engagement and journey in church planting, you've actually called for a renewed focus on church planting, but you've been doing this for decades. So why is this a time to renew our commitment to church planting through the manifesto and through the advancement of church planting as a mission endeavor? Why?
Yeah, so I've actually been doing church planting for 40 years.
Oof.
And yeah, I planted my first church just a few months after I became a Christian. And in fact, planted 3 churches within just a very few years after that, and then kept on planting. And back in those days, there were no church planting conferences. There were few church planting books. There were I don't think there were any church planting professionals. Nobody saw themselves as your key church planting professional in the US, hardly anybody at all. And so we did a lot of things by trial and error, experimentation, et cetera. And now it's a different era. And we have lots of books, lots of conferences. Um, we're comfortable with the idea of franchising church, almost like small businesses. But in the middle of that, what's happening is our methodology is less successful. We've come into a new era. In fact, the manifesto says, excuse me, I'm sorry, even in the first chapter, that I'm going to read it here, that the current models of church are suffering attrition in both evangelistic effectiveness and cultural influence. And now in this day of shifting values and the things that we've been trying just aren't working the same, it's time for a new R&D culture. And I feel like the manifesto for me is a piece of relief. It's principle based rather than methodology based. I'm sorry, I don't know why I have this.
No worries. It all happens sometimes when we're on Zoom. So
I
don't you worry
know.
about that at all. If you need to take a drink, I can actually fill the time if you need to take a break. But if you're good, keep going.
Anyhow, and so because it's principle based, I can draw and I can go back to it. I have the freedom to be experimental. And the other thing is that I think it leaves room for the apostolically gifted. Like a lot of the current, whether it be an assessment or models of church, are looking at these top church planter, pastor, teacher types, and they don't even know how to assess for that person who's apostolic, and the apostolic person thinks in terms of future better than the present tense. Often, sometimes just really sucks at doing the present tense, but they do the future tense well. So in this time where we need to experiment, I feel like that's a good start for us. Why don't you ask me a question while I cough?
No worries. You go ahead and cough, and we'll do that. But I will say, I wouldn't even I'll just talk for just a second, because I do think, even earlier we had some conversation about apostolic and how we use that term. The way, and Linda and I have known each other a long time, the way we're using that term is not the creation of a new or a reestablishment or even the re-recognition of a new office of a big A apostle, but rather this apostolic impulse that is, actually more of a New Testament word. The word mission is not a New Testament word. It's actually a Latin word that comes from a Greek word, apostolos. And so that apostolic or that mission impulse becomes central for us as well. So you've talked some about, and in the manifesto, part of the intent is to call forth some more of that apostolic or that missional thinking and engagement. And right at the introduction, it talks some about that. You were one of the key framers of that, gave such great inputs through our whole conversation. So tell us more as you think about this. Because, some would say church planting is the big thing. We're all, we love the Exponential Conference. That's Church Plantapalooza, as I like to call it. And there's, it's the largest church planting conference, I think, in the galaxy, is what they say now. When I used to speak at that, that's what we used to just call the National New Church Conference. And I remember speaking at it, there are 500 people there. Now there's like 500 people in the breakouts. So why do we need to change anything, Linda, if the church planting conferences are packed?
Yeah, because it's not working. Because we're as the manifesto suggests, we're losing the capacity to do what we've been doing. The other thing that I think is really important is as we so the world is becoming more connected, more global, as Sam George mentioned earlier, and I think that even the fact that we have a manifesto, that we have um, even the fact that we have right now a global pandemic is evidence of a world that's ultimately connected. And yet I feel like we haven't continued to learn from the rest of the world, and the world is speaking into us and we're not listening. So recently, for instance, some of the experiments we're running, I've got a church planter from Hyderabad, India, in the Bay Area. He preaches in the Telugu language online to his dad's church in Hyderabad, India, and he himself speaks Chinese and Japanese and Telugu and Tamil and Hindi and all of that. And he's a co-vocational planter. He's a scientist, PhD scientist. So he does that on Sundays, and on Friday he's leading a worship service in English that's multi-ethnic. I have a guy who is a Nepali church planter who started all kinds of churches in Nepal. Now he's here starting churches, but 5 days a week he is speaking to people in Nepal and doing discipleship in Nepal. I've got a new church with a man who's from China, and he's speaking into Shanghai, China. So some of the experiments that we're getting from a world that I think the manifesto now acknowledges, a world that's very connected, allows us to actually see with different eyes. I love one of the experiments I love that's helped me to see is there's something called the Human Genome Project. And it was actually a Christian who came up with the idea that what they would do is they could map the human body faster and better, more completely, if they included thinkers from the East and the West, and everybody came together. And that actually happened. And what I think in terms of our future together is if we can learn from the eyes of all these cultures from all over the world, again, like the manifesto is calling for, that we can all see God better and more completely.
Yeah, and I like the concept of that. I like the fact that you have specific examples of that, because my experience has been that whenever I get into meetings like this, I hear a lot of people say, we got to learn from the world. And then we plan a thing with speakers from the world and nobody comes because it's not the speakers that they like to listen to and come to conferences. So how are you, because you're implying that some locally, and we're calling for that in the Church Planting Manifesto, and we modeled some of that earlier here today. But the reality is, it seems that most church planter leaders would rather hear from the pragmatic practitioners who've gone before them and have had great success, rather than the global leaders who are different from them. How do we help people to see that different from them may be what we need in 2020 and 2021?
Yeah, so I think that's changing. And I think a younger generation isn't necessarily listening to the old in the same way. They're trying new things, they're just not being heard yet. We have, and one of the things I think is really helpful with the pandemic was that a lot of the older pastors, existing church pastors, didn't know how to do the online thing. And so the younger church planners taught them how to do it. And so what you had was at least an early example of the old learning from the young. And I think another thing is when they go overseas and they just see with their eyes different things happening, they had no idea. Something else that I feel like is really important is the practice of cultural intelligence. And so I've been taking all the free online cultural intelligence webinars that I can. It's being taught to our people across disciplines. So I went to one in an engineering school, one in a biology class, psychology, business classes, and I'm learning the ideas and concept of cultural intelligence that our lay people are learning anyhow, but haven't thought about how to apply that in the church setting. And so if we can move past the idea of a multi-ethnic church into maybe a more international church, and a church that has the coming and the going and the receiving and the sending, I think that the cultural intelligence is a practice that helps us move in that direction. I could actually talk about this for a year.
Well, we don't have a year, but we do like hearing from Linda. If you want to hear more from Linda as well, I want to encourage you to pick up some of her books. She's been a gift to many of us. You can see in the comments that a lot of people have been saying things about Linda because we are very grateful for her. But she's co-written City-Shaped Churches, Planting Churches in the Global Era, The Church Turned Inside Out, along with, these are co-authored in some cases, The Wholehearted Church Planter, lots of good resources that you can find as well. So thank you, Linda. Let's go on to talk a little bit more with D.A. Horton. D.A., last time we talked, we were talking about your book. Your book is intentional, and the tension is sort of emphasized, intentional. And I know that this is an area, as you've sort of been indicating, exploring some of your own Latino, Mexican heritage as well. You've talked some about how we navigate some of these challenging times. You wrote a 4-part series for me at Christianity Today on how to think about Black Lives Matter and more. So this has been an issue that you have been thinking through and engaging. But obviously, it feels like there's some things different about our cultural moment in North America, right? Where conversations in the U.S. Have been in and around after the killing of George Floyd, a greater sense of awareness of minorities. That almost all the books that were written, even Christian books that were written on race, suddenly were sold out, and printers had to print more. In Canada, the conversation around visible minorities and engaging in what's often a much more cross-cultural context, but still tension, whether it be Haitians in Halifax or whether it be immigrants in Red Deer, some of the challenge that's there. So talk to us a little bit about what's different in this cultural moment in the pandemic, and also in and around increased racial tensions, because they seem to be related. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. As I look at our manifesto, principle number 5 reads, planting churches that bear witness to the redemptive presence of the kingdom of God in the world requires a holistic engagement of the community with the whole gospel. And the reason I want to frame my response around that principle is because I think more so in the United States of America than Canada, what we are seeing is the tension of a big literal kingdom theology of the scripture versus the Americanization of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And this is providing a polarized binary way of thinking here, specifically in the United States. And it is fueling the divisiveness in our communities, amongst churches, amongst leaders, conference content. Basically, it's almost like a revival of the, modernism versus fundamentalism controversies that were going on in the early 1900s to the mid 1900s. But this time it's a little bit more different because America is not black and white as it once was. Now it is, multi-linguistic, multi-colors. And so even looking at the nuances of American fundamentalism, I find it interesting how in the early 1900s, the individuals within the Christian paradigm that did not meet the fundamentalist definition of orthodoxy were literally ridiculed and called hopelessly erroneous. And there are just all these attacks that were given. And we're seeing a revival of that. Terms such as critical race theory is now the new boogeyman. People who are conservative in their theology within evangelicalism have denied systemic sinful systems till they were blue in the face. But now all of a sudden, voter fraud, which is a systemic issue, is all of a sudden something that is real. And so what I began to see is that people are more comfortable in defending this Americanized view of orthodoxy, the Americanized view of what a local church and what beliefs should look like, more so than the genuine, robust gospel that unpacks the beautiful truth of, as we know, creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And so as I'm looking at that, I'm looking at even the doctrine of Americanization throughout American history and how it was unholy, like woven together with Protestantism specifically as it relates to what we would call racial minorities, not just those of African descent, but those of Native Indigenous descent and obviously Mexican descent as well. And some of the key components that I realize is that with the idea of Americanization, it has basically shown us the reality of a hostility towards immigration. Even going back post World War I, that in order to be American, you have to exchange your ethnic identity for one that is American, this new identity. But unfortunately, because Protestantism, was the soup du jour of the day back then, it's almost as if Americanism and Protestantism has to be one and the same, which is unholy. I mean, that's exactly what Francis Schaeffer talked about in The Great Evangelical Disaster, that when you wrap the cross of Christ in the flag of your country, you have created this unholy version of true Christianity. And so what I'm seeing right now in the midst of all of this tension that is inclusive of ethnic tensions versus just social class tensions within evangelicalism is this strong fighting for an Americanized view of the gospel versus a kingdom understanding of the scripture. So in all of our church planting efforts, this is what we're going to keep bumping up against, is people not wanting to fund, not wanting to support, but also working against church plants that are taking this missiological approach that we see in the manifesto and principle number 5.
Well, I do. You mentioned critical race theory. I've heard a little bit about that. I've actually seen that seems to be like the biggest thing right now facing the church. It seems to be that the it's not racism that's facing the church is the biggest concern. It's not systemic racism in culture. It is that some folks seem to have decided that people like Tim Keller and have actually gone like theologically heterodox. So are you saying that critical race theory is okay? Are you saying it's not okay? It's how do we address some of the pushback, the white lash that has come back as a lot of Christians after the death of the killing of George Floyd got engaged, and then they kind of felt like, well, if I get engaged, if I speak up or speak out, people say I'm a critical race theorist, something that nobody like probably ever heard of a year and a half ago, but now everyone's an expert on what it is.
Yeah.
So what does that matter?
I think, as an academic and as a missiologist, my personal use of critical race theory actually grants me a passport in the academy to at the table. So when I leverage this as an available tool, I'm able to engage the conversation as it relates to what is known as spiritual capital within the community cultural wealth model that was developed through the lens of Latin critical race theory. And so when I look at that, I'm now seeing an open door in the academy to actually engage the conversation about spirituality, which is inclusive of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so for my efforts, the reality of critical race theory is actually something that I can use to break into a system that has been humanistic, and they have parsed God out successfully from the entire conversation surrounding this. I have talked to PhDs who informed me that in their qualitative analysis, they were told by their PhD instructors, every reference to God, religion, or spirituality, you mark that out. They have successfully and systemically parsed God out of the research. And so now what I recognize is that when I have tried to talk to evangelicals about critical race theory, what I'm trying to help them understand is that the popular books that they're reading about these things, like Bev D'Angelo, she's not a scholar in critical race theory. They are not engaging the primary sources. And as evangelicals, we know that we would not take that same approach to exegeting the text. Whenever we look at a text, we're not going to go to a commentary from somebody else. We want to dive into the languages. We want to parse the verbs. We want to look at syntax. But all of a sudden now, when it comes to the topic of critical race theory, we want to go watch a 2-hour video by James White. And now we feel qualified that we can respond to this new boogeyman that is infiltrating the church. And that's what I'm saying. It's almost like the Red Scare of the 1950s all over again. It's almost like people being called the same terms that were pejoratively thrown at people who were quote unquote progressive or whatever back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And it's basically fear mongering. And what it's doing is causing more divisiveness. So even when I engage the nuances of critical race theory, and I give a biblical analysis of critical race theory in the articles that I've written on my own personal blog, what I recognize is that people will read the tweet that highlights the link, but they won't read the article that I've written. So when I talk to them about how there are certain components of critical race theory that highlight sociological truths, a lot of Christians don't have the language to process and understand that. And one of the greatest ways that I see that is even understanding the idea of race being a social construct. And when I engage that dialogue, automatically people, oh, you're a critical race theorist. I'm like, you don't even understand what I'm saying, because the same people you're telling me to go listen to their podcast, they are affirming the fact that this idea of race is a man-made social construct, where biblically we see ethnicity is the reality of the scriptures. Even pantata ethne, when we look at Revelation chapter 21, verses 24 through 26, it's the ethnicities of the world that are entering into the city of God. So when we look at those truths, then that's where we can say, yes, it is a social construct. So that allows us as believers to actually engage with refreshing language that has its root in scripture, not the colonial aspects of what went on in the Americas from Spain and Portugal. And so when people don't want to read and they want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater because they're fearful of becoming whatever pejorative term they're throwing on us as missiologists, it gets very exhausting because you're having to overqualify for one. And then for the non-believers, I mean, I've literally had Marxists tell me, bro, you are not a Marxist. And I'm like, I know, but you can't convince those who are indwelt by the Holy Spirit that are my brothers and sisters in the faith that I'm not a Marxist. No matter what I say, I'm always going to be seen through this lens. And so that's where I think, as it relates to church planting, this is why I think it is so crucial for our manifesto. This is why the Send Institute is really engaging a balanced perspective to create dialogue and provide planters and pastors and their families and supporters with resources that are very balanced. We don't have to negate the word of God because we can affirm some sociological realities, but rather we are trying to give resources and tools to those that are doing the frontline work of church planting so that they can have what our number 9 principle says, healthy communication and collaboration amongst groups, especially at local levels, because that is essential as it relates for multiplication. So multiplying balanced believers, that's the work of missiology. We engage the soft sciences, we engage strong theology, and we engage the work of compassion all in one. So I do see a brighter future. However, it is going to be an exhausting future because the world is going to reject our message. And it's unfortunately that if we don't follow the Americanized pattern of what we're communicating, then many within evangelicalism will reject us as harshly as the world as well.
I want to ask more, but I'll stop there for now, and we may swing back around because I want to get to Scott Moreau. And Scott and I served together. We're both deans at Wheaton College and peers in that sense, but also Scott's on the faculty of the school that I had the privilege of serving as the dean of the School of Mission, Ministry, and Leadership. And so Scott's writings have shaped so many of us. It's funny because I was quoting Scott all over the world, teaching things when I finally got to work with Scott, and it was a joy to be able to do that as well. So Scott, one of the things that we know, this is a missiologist council that's focused on North America. And, you know, we know that we might say the re-evangelization of the West was a phrase that people began to use, began to use, others. And here we're talking about the application of missiology, which is a discipline, to a context. And really, there's not a missiology, there's missiologies and of Western culture. But one of the things that we're asking is, how can the participants here in our call, these emerging missiologists, how can they be a part of re-examining and refreshing our missiology for mission in North American cultural realities?
I think perhaps the hardest thing to do is to bring missiology home, because traditionally the training in missiology has been to go over there and to see what's going on over there. It's not to come here. And yet that's what we need to be able to do. We need to turn the mirror around, if I can use that as a strange strangled metaphor, and say, what does it mean for me to take this stuff I've learned and not think about over there, but think about here, think about myself, think about my own people. DA, I vote we go back to DA for the remaining time of this panel, because I'd like to hear more from him. I deeply appreciated what he brings to the table. My concern, and it parallels, DA, what you're saying, is that we've turned into a social media headline culture. And if you read the headline, you know where somebody's coming from, even if you've never read the article. And so deep think missiological reflection seems to be, at the very least, a deep challenge for us at this point in time in our culture. And I would say, if participants are going to bring missiology for mission in North America back, part of the frame has to be able to lead people into thinking. And I think a part of it is we're threatened by things we don't like or don't understand. So instead of taking the time to read them, come to grips them and see what's good in them, but also critique them, we lose the opportunity to engage the ideas. And I would say, I would like to challenge everybody here to be thinking through, what headlines am I following and I'm ignoring the depth? But depth takes time. It doesn't happen, and I'm 65 years old, so I've got a lot more years on most of you. I won't name those I don't have any years on, but most of you I've got more years on. And so I've had time to think and watch this as it's taking place. But I fear a few things. Commodification of church planting. We've turned it into a widget producing factory, and the popularity of the conferences that we have doesn't necessarily speak well to me what's going to happen in church planting unless we're able to get outside of the commodification box. And that's a hard thing to do, because if you don't generate funding, you're not going to have the conferences. That's one of the things Zoom has enabled. How much did you pay to come to this? And the nice thing is, as far as I know, nobody traveled anywhere to get to this. We did it via Zoom. This is opening doors for us to think missiologically without having to pay attention to the economy that's underlying some of our thoughts and our decisions. I'll leave it there, Ed. I know I'm rambling right now, but the frame.
Oh, no, I like your rambling. I think part of the challenge is deep think. You use the phrase, take some deep thinking, is that's not our specialty right now. We've actually, I think social media has made us stupider. And the end result is, how many times do I tweet, just read the article? Right. But, think about the missiological controversies that, Scott, that you were engaged and involved with, and I'm not sure how much you can share. But, the assumption that everyone who would be hesitant about translating the Son of God phrase must therefore not believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or must therefore trying to compromise something. Yet this is a major question in Muslim contexts, is how do we have a conversation about who Jesus is when the idea of God having a son is a fundamentally offensive idea? Or for that matter, do we use the name Allah to describe God, which is the pre-Islam name in some countries, and some countries it's not. In Malaysia, or Indonesia, it's illegal to use the name Allah to describe the Christian. Malaysia, it was Malaysia. Okay, it's illegal to describe the Christian God using the term Allah. Yet, that's the term that is pre-Muslim term in many other contexts as well. So I've seen people sit back and throw stones very casually about missiological struggles that missionaries who really love Jesus and have vested their lives in reaching, for example, Muslims, have wrestled through how to figure out how best to do that, and maybe have made decisions that a less informed person would not make. And yet now we're dealing with these same realities here, where people are struggling through, and people, I read, I got a 6-minute video from, I'm not going to name names. I love the fact that D.A. Horton just started naming names there, but I can tell you the 6-minute videos I get, and a 2-hour video. I wish people listen to a 2-hour video. I get the 6-minute videos from somebody like, well, look, they owned this person. And it's like, okay, whatever. You don't even know what it's talking about. So here's the challenge. For Scott, for decades, missionaries tried to work through how best to engage culture in their context, far away from people in the West who weren't there kind of scrutinizing every conversation and decision. We don't get to do that anymore. How do we do missiology in the midst of a high level of scrutinization, which I welcome among people who will take the time to understand, but part of the challenge is a lot of people don't want to. So how does the missiologist function well in a time when people don't think deeply about issues? Is it just something we have to just get used to, the background noise or challenge? Are there times when we're going to say, no, we do need to make some change to address this? We don't want to be unresponsive to critics. So help us to think through that.
One of the directions I've been going, Ed, and this might be news to you, is I've been thinking less about writing and more about videos. Okay, I've done enough writing to satisfy myself for the rest of my life. I don't need to write another book. But what is something that might make a difference in the church? It might be that 6-minute video that gets somebody thinking about something for the first time in a new way. We do live in a time when stone throwing generates headlines, which generates viewership. And if we're living a popularity game, as too many Christians are in the Twitterverse and in the other verses that we're dealing with in social media, then they're being rewarded by throwing those stones, not having read in depth what they're dealing with to begin with. Now, that's a stone in itself, the way I'm throwing it out. I think of the example of our commander-in-chief in the White House and wonder who is providing him with the information that's driving his current conspiracy theories that are kind of attacking our democratic process here in the United States. I don't know that he needs anybody to feed him anything. He's narcissistic enough to be able to feed himself, and he does that on a regular basis. And my apologies for calling out if some of you don't like where I'm coming from politically, but that's the reality of the
We're
world.
we're allowed to have opinions, and we may not all share the same ones, but they're an important part of the conversation.
They are. So Ed, and on one side, maybe I could say it this way: stick to the text. One is the biblical text, but the other is the text of culture. And the third might be the text of history. But those take time. And don't let the stone throwing stop you from taking time, but you might need to, as we do when we cross cultures, modify your methods. Okay, I'm going into the land where social media rules. I'm going into the land where videos can capture attention and get people to think differently in ways that books don't anymore. If I write books, I'm writing for the people here. I'm not writing for the person in the pew. You know, and Ed, you're aware of the study that was done on how many pastors read, or how many missions pastors read missions books. They don't have the time nor the inclination. So I'm thinking maybe our strategy needs to be things like the Manifesto, which is short and readable, rather than an entire book, which somebody says, I don't have the energy to do that. I've got a stack of 25 books sitting here that publishers have sent me that I haven't had time to read yet. Soon they're going to join the stack of 25 books that I had 2 months ago that I put on my bookshelf because I got tired of seeing them on my desk. That's part of the challenge we face right now. It's a golden era for publishers, and they're selling books. I'm just not sure what's actually done in terms of the reading and implementation of them.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the response to the video you created for the Send Institute post-pandemic missiology conversations. And, you know, that was, people were like watching that all over the place. And it wasn't shallow. It was brief, but filled with helpful information. So is, in a sense, if we can't beat them, join them, but maybe help them to think a little more about some of these issues. Maybe tell me a little more.
Be as shrewd as social media users, but as innocent as doves. There's a sense in which when I go to a new cultural setting, I look at how they learn, I look at how they teach, I look at how they communicate, I look at how they motivate, I look at how they make decisions, and what things can be utilized in a way that conforms to the gospel or is congruent with the gospel. I take advantage of the methodologies and the frames of reference they have here. Why don't I do that here? Now, I can sit back and criticize and say it's all going to hell in a handbasket, but the simple reality is this is where the culture is today. How do I engage them where they are rather than make them come to my space? And so one of the things I do is I start a science fiction book club with another colleague at the school, and we're now meeting via Zoom. The funny thing is everybody's scattered, so we could no longer even meet physically. COVID has generated the opportunity for 5 science fiction geeks to get together over something we love, and it provides occasional opportunities to intersperse the gospel, but we're not looking to bring the 4 laws into conversations. We're looking to bring God and Jesus and religious values into conversations in ways that fit the conversations. We're having fun.
Yeah, just so everyone knows, the 4 laws is a science fiction reference. And I got the reference.
3 laws of robotics, right. The 4 laws of the Britotics.
There you go. So I just wanted you to see that was in there. So not the 4 spiritual laws. And I would say I have been deeply disappointed by 2 Dune miniseries thus far, and the new one better be good, or I'm done with Dune miniseries. Thank you, Scott Moreau, for your input. So thank you for our panel today. You know, panels in COVID time are tougher because I walk through and have an interview and a conversation. But part of the challenge you're hearing here is how do we have thoughtful conversations in a thoughtless time? And I think that's part of what we've got to hold up. We've got to not buy into that we need to not have these hard conversations. We need to have thoughtful conversations in a thoughtless time. And in the midst of that, we've got to engage some of the tools of the time. We've talked about social media. We've talked some about how we might engage some of the tools that CRT and others do. But in all of those cases, bring a different message. When there's contradiction, push against it. When there's a lack of clarity, go deeper, and ultimately bring some hope in the midst of all of this. Because the world's pathways, whether they be, you know, social media arguments, or, for example, or the end result of maybe a critical race theory, they're not going to satisfy to what the good news of the gospel and the engaging in the mission can bring.